This is from Teddy Baldessar. The Watches of James Bond, a complete guide. This should be a lot of fun. Because James Bond has had some really cool watches. And some of them had really cool gadgets from Q Branch built right in. Let's take a look at his choice of watches through the years. 3, 2, 1, go.
The name's Bond. James Bond. That was the line that introduced us to one of the most classic characters of all time. He's been in movies for more than 60 years, and he's been in novels for even longer than that. And in all the various takes
Close to
on the
70
character,
years now.
there's been one thing that's been consistent. He's always wearing a watch.
A really
James Bond's
cool
watches
watch,
are about
too.
more than just telling time. They can be weapons, they can be communication devices. They're always an extension of his character, and they also reflect the times that that character lives in. Most every James Bond mission begins right here, in M's office. Of course, this isn't really an office, this is actually a set, but I thought it was an appropriate place to begin our mission of delving into the watches of James Bond.
Phone's facing the wrong way.
You'll learn something that you
Gruen Precision. I believe this was the first watch that James Bond ever wore, before he even had the Rolex on screen. So Sean Connery, when he was in Black Tie, and he had that whole scene with Sylvia Trench. You know, I admire your courage, Miss Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr. Bond. James Bond. I believe he was wearing a Gruen Precision.
haven't learned before. I've got a wide array of James Bond related watches here with me. In fact, this is probably the first time that a lot of these have been in the same room together. But the name's Bernardo, Mark Bernardo. I'm the director of editorial content at teddybaldessar.com, and I'm James Bond's super fan. And I'm going to be taking you today through the history of James Bond's watches.
The one thing I hope that you'll pick up from all of this chart, I mean, we're going to be looking at some expensive watches, some rare watches. A lot of them are not available anymore to the public, or they've, changed somehow. Listen, you don't have to have a Rolex to have a really cool watch. There's cheaper alternatives out there that do the job just as well, still look the business, and will bring you a measure of confidence. Because you'll have a precision timekeeping instrument. And I would say for anyone, no matter who you are or where you are or what you do in life, always have the time. Always have a watch so that you can tell the time. Smartphone batteries die. Smartwatches are not really so smart, and they've got planned obsolescence, and they eventually lose their charge and won't hold a charge. But something as simple as a quartz movement field watch will last you decades, possibly even beyond your years. Something which you can bequeath to your sons or your grandsons. And all you have to do is maybe swap out a battery once every 10 years. And it still runs like a champ. Patek Philippe and Frédéric Constant look more interesting to me than Rolexes. They're certainly more elegant, I think. Generally prefer pocket watches to wrist watches, which I think can be annoying to my wrist. Yeah, there's people out there who still prefer the old-fashioned pocket watch. And let's face it, wristwatches started out in life as nothing more than pocket watches that had some straps bolted onto them.
Chapter 1. The Bond of Books. The story of James Bond begins with his creator, author Ian Fleming. Fleming had almost as interesting a life as James Bond himself. He went to a prestigious military academy but flunked out, tried his hand.
So much of James Bond's life was modeled after was really just kind of sanitized retelling of life stories from Ian Fleming. Even the description of Bond in the books so often is a vague description of what Ian Fleming looked like, IRL. Wristwatches were only invented because of the military need from officers needing to be able to tell the time without giving up their hands to do so during the First World War. That's true, Harold. Yes. Before that time, it was considered rather effeminate for a man to be wearing a wristwatch. That was seen more fitting for a woman. But the war changed that.
At being a stockbroker, and that didn't take. From there, he found a bit of a calling as a journalist for Reuters. And this is where he was exposed to the world of government intelligence gathering and espionage. This led him to a high-level job in the British military, in naval intelligence, during World War II. When Fleming left government service, he was determined to make a living as a writer. When he sat down at his writer's desk at his house in Jamaica, he decided that the character that he created was going to be a character very much influenced by his very interesting wartime intelligence experiences.
The house in Jamaica that he wrote all of the Bond novels at. Fun fact. The name of it, the estate that it's built on, is called GoldenEye. Some of you may remember that as the first film that Pierce Brosnan appeared in as James Bond. And if you were a 90s kid, you grew up playing a game for the Nintendo 64 called GoldenEye, which still is one of the best first-person shooters, and still one of the best Bond games of all time. I've got a Bulliver Lunar Pilot. Unfortunately, never have anywhere to wear it. Wear it anyway. Whatever you like. Out and about? Wear it to work? I mean, it is a... It's one of those, I mean, you could call it a go anywhere, do anything sort of watch, and it's tough enough that you can put it in some rough situations and it'll come out unscathed. I mean, you have to remember, it is a watch that went to the moon. I would definitely recommend just wear it, man. I mean, you've got a wristwatch that is part of a legacy of watches that went to the moon. It's got one hell of a story to it. It'd be a pity to keep the jewels locked up like that. I'd say wear it. Out and about, wear it at home, whatever you like, but wear it with pride. Because that's a damn good watch, the Lunar Pilot. I'd love to have one myself. I do miss it, yeah. It's still one of the greatest injustices to the gaming world is the fact that we do not have any sort of re-release or remake of GoldenEye. And unfortunately, I think the blame rests at this point with Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, who are still the heads of Danjak. That's the game where the bullets in the magazine were flat texture on the item shape. Yeah, a lot of compression going on with that, but incredible game. Factory, not going to wear a nice watch. Okay, that's fair. That part is fair. Could understand that.
And that character was James Bond. The name James Bond nowadays conjures up images of style and elegance and adventure. But when Ian Fleming chose that name for his character, it was conjuring up anything but. James Bond was the name of an actual ornithologist who wrote books about birds. The reason...
Yeah, he took the name from a book titled Birds of the West Indies by James Bond. He wanted the name to be as bland as possible, but a spy who could blend in anywhere.
That he chose what he felt was such a bland name was because the character of James Bond, as he originally envisioned it, was what he called a blunt instrument. A character that didn't really grow, a character that did his mission and other characters grew and evolved around him in the course of that mission. Bond himself was meant to be a catalyst for events more so than a character with a lot of layers. It all started with this book, Casino Royale, published in 1953.
Alternate title, you asked for it. Fleming's attempt to write the spy novel to end all spy novels, and was partly challenged by his wife at the time. And it was a smash hit. People loved it.
It was Ian Fleming's first novel, the first appearance of James Bond, and it set the stage for the entire monster franchise that would follow. Fleming
James Bond was also an international playboy. Yeah, in the movies he was. In the books, not so much. He might sleep with one woman per book, if he was lucky. The books themselves are much more darker and grittier than the product we got in the film version. Birdism is peak.
was also a man of discerning tastes, and this came through in the novels that he wrote. He had specific tastes about what he liked to eat, what he liked to drink, and also what watch he wore. Fleming was known to own and wear a Rolex Explorer. The Rolex...
It's really good, go anywhere, do anything type watch. Very simple. It tells the time, no date function, no twisty divers bezel and anything like that. It's really quite good. There's cheaper versions out there, chat, if you want to get your hands on something that is like a Rolex Explorer, but you don't want to pay close to $10,000 for a used example. There's a company called Vtuber. They take citizen quartz movements or Swiss Celita movements and assemble them in America. But the quartz watches in particular, I've got a Vtuber field watch that has military time applications to it. I think runs all of maybe $200, $250 tops if you want to get a metal bracelet rather than a strap. But they do have their own version, very similar to a Rolex Explorer, with the 3, 6, and 9 dial, pips everywhere else. Very good, affordable alternative. Super accurate with the quartz movement, and very affordable, being that it's about, $200-ish US. Kind of hits that sweet spot. Though if you want something that's a bit more historically close to a Rolex Explorer without paying Rolex prices, Nevada Gentian, the Super Antarctic. That one's more expensive. Higher end Celita automatic movement. Probably looking about $1,000 to $1,200 for that one. Like I said, expensive, but definitely not as much as you would pay for the Rolex. But still has still coming from a historical revived brand with Nevada.
Rolex Explorer, which actually came out the same year as Casino Royale, was known as an adventurer's watch at the time. And what many consider to be the first original real James Bond watch is a Rolex Explorer, despite the fact that
it's a go anywhere, do anything sort of watch. You can wear it on a bracelet. You can find some really nice quick release leather or leather straps. It even goes well with a NATO strap. It's just so many applications for it. Dress it up, dress it down. A watch for all occasions. A watch is always a merit, indeed.
It was never worn by any Bond actor on screen. Why it's considered maybe the original James Bond watch is that when Fleming did finally get around to describing James Bond's watch, which wasn't until the second novel, which was Live and Let Die, he described it pretty much how his Rolex Explorer would have been described. He used phrases like big luminous numerals, expanding bracelet, stainless steel case. This is really all the description we ever really got about the watch that James Bond wore in the novels. When it finally came time to bring James Bond to the big screen, it was time for a producer named Albert Cubby Broccoli to enter the scene. A big fan of the novels and really dedicated to making them work on the silver screen. Cubby Broccoli and eventually his family would stay with the franchise for 50 years. Chapter 2, the Sean Connery.
Yeah. It was originally Cubby Broccoli and a gentleman named Harry Saltzman who were first working together. Saltzman had some financial troubles in the 70s and eventually had to sell his stake in the Bond films and production to Broccoli and had to liquidate a lot of things. Children and grandchildren ended up living very modest lives afterwards. And yeah, eventually, as we've seen in recent years, when MGM was sold to Amazon, also went with it the sale of the James Bond franchise, along with a lot of the creative control that the Broccoli family originally had.
Era. After the popularity of the James Bond novels, James Bond was destined to be on the big screen.
In the 1960s, it became almost custom for graduates of Army Special Forces training to run out and buy a Rolex. Makes sense. They used to be much cheaper, much sportier watches. Nowadays, they're far too dressy and far too expensive and far too valuable, for that matter, to put through the ringer like that. But yeah, it used to be they were sort of a man's type watch. And now it's just expensive jewelry.
Fleming and Cubby Broccoli and Eon Productions all needed to agree on an actor to play James Bond. Sean Connery, who was actually in that first movie and to many is the quintessential James Bond, was far from a sure thing
First
of
and the
getting
best.
the role at first. Fleming himself was not really a fan of the Scottish actor. He thought he was a roughneck and didn't project enough of the elegance that he pictured in his character.
Yeah, that's true. Broccoli and Saltzman saw potential. Fleming did not like what he saw. The first Bond film director, Terence Young, definitely saw the potential. He also had a job to do. So he went out and did it. And basically put Connery through his paces and coached him and mentored him into what we finally got with the Bond films. So much of that elegant portion of Connery's Bond, that was the director, Terence Young, taking him in hand and showing him what it means to be a gentleman. Honestly, had Terence Young been younger, he probably would have just played James Bond himself and directed the film. Directed and starred in the film. Wasn't Connery a lorry driver before acting? I think he was a tradesman of some kind. It's possible he was a lorry driver, yeah. I'm not really sure, but I know he did come from a blue collar background, a working class background. But yeah, so they frequently called him a rough diamond. And it was Terence Young who was able to put a lot of polish on him and on his performance, to the point that it impressed Fleming so that he would eventually write a bit of backstory for Bond of him being at least partially Scottish and raised in Scotland. And that's how eventually, in the film Skyfall, you have Bond returning to his roots in Scotland.
Broccoli himself was looking for someone like Cary Grant, who was aging at the time but had shown a lot of acting chops in.
Yeah, Grant was getting on in age. They really wanted him. Grant refused to do the films because he knew they wanted to sign him to a multi-picture deal. He didn't want to be tied down by that. He wanted the freedom to be able to do multiple films. And this was back in a time when you were starting in films, you could maybe do one or two, a small handful every year, but you had to be really choosy about it. And Grant he did not want to be tied down to any sort of multi-picture deal, which is what Broccoli and Saltzman wanted with anyone that they signed to the films.
Espionage-style movies. Fleming really wanted someone like David Niven or even Richard Burton to play the role, but Connery won everybody over with his signature toughness mixed with.
Another thing, Dr. No was at the time fair to say it was kind of a low-budget picture. So that's another thing. They didn't have the budget for David Niven or Cary Grant or any of those people, or Richard Burton. They could afford a relative unknown actor, and so they had to take a bit of a gamble. They gambled with Connery, and they won big.
Elegance. The first Bond movie was Dr. No in 1962, and to many, this established the quintessential James Bond for the movies. The first watch that we see James Bond wearing is one that many people probably would be unaware of. It was a small gold dress watch, Gruen Precision 510, and while he does not wear the watch throughout the entirety of the movie, he is wearing that watch in the now classic scene where we first meet Sean Connery's Bond in the dinner jacket, in the casino, uttering for the first time the famous line, "Bond, James Bond." Gruen was a brand based in Ohio, an American watch brand back in the day when America hosted a lot more watch brands that eventually.
Back when a lot more things were made with pride in America. The closest you could come to something like this now, especially this whole look and feel chart, I would say modern equivalents, look at a brand called Orient. Orient has a line of slim wristwatches like this called the Bambino, the Orient Bambino. Orient's a good brand. I would say that their mechanical watches are in many ways, they rival the accuracy of Seiko's, which is interesting because Seiko actually owns Orient. But really good company, really affordable watches too. You'll probably only pay about $200 thereabouts for something that looks very similar to this here.
Actually moved its production to Switzerland. And the Gruen may have actually been Connery's own watch. The watch that we more associate
that would not be surprising.
With early cinematic James Bond, and particularly Sean Connery, is a much more famous model. It was a Rolex Submariner reference 6538. No one is really quite sure, but as the story goes, the producers knew that James Bond was supposed to wear a Rolex. And Cubby Broccoli owned a Submariner. People have speculated over the years that it was Connery's own Submariner, but the evidence more seems to point that it was Broccoli's watch, and he lent it to Connery to wear on screen. You get a glimpse of.
It just goes to show you how low budget that first film was. I had my great-grandfather's silver Waltham pocket watch. Hang on to it. Not just the sentimental value, but the thing's probably worth a fortune too.
the Rolex Submariner on
That
Connery's
takes some
wrist
trust.
in
It
the
does.
famous
You
scene
break it, you
where
buy it.
Ursula Andress as Honey Rider comes out of the surf to greet James Bond, who's sleeping on the beach. The second Bond movie was From Russia with Love in 1963, just a year after the first one. It's again starred Sean Connery as James Bond, wearing his same Rolex Submariner. Trivia about From Russia with Love: the novel was President John F. Kennedy's favorite book, and he said so in an interview, which was another factor that helped in the popularity of the Bond novels and eventually led to the James Bond movies. It also led to the decision to make From Russia with Love the second movie, though it wasn't actually the second novel. And what happened was JFK was so excited that his favorite book was being made into a movie that he screened it at the White House in 1963. The tragic footnote is that he screened it the night before he left for Dallas, where he was assassinated. So this really cements that movie as a marker in 60s culture. I learned that just a week ago.
Incredible.
Goldfinger in 1964 was really the first Bond movie that set the tone for the series. With the gadgets, the outlandish villains, the double entendres. It was also the first Bond movie that gave us a close-up of James Bond's watch. The scene
Yeah, it was From Russia with Love and Dr. No were really just kind of prologues to Goldfinger, which ignited a true worldwide phenomenon that reached epic proportions with Thunderball, and Aeon Productions just sort of rode that wave for decades afterwards.
of James Bond in his dinner jacket checking his Rolex Submariner on its military-style NATO strap is the scene that really established for many.
And you've got so many companies out there that make their own versions of this NATO strap. I think even one that I go to quite frequently, Zulu Diver, I think they've got their own version of this. Which, it's a lovely color combination. Just brought it because the American Waltham used to be the world standard for train conductors' watches. Oh, yeah. I like how in the Connery Bond movies, his white tux is more of a creamy quality. Yeah, that might be a function of the exposure of the film, but it could also be that it's slightly off-white. I know in later Bond films, if he is wearing a white tuxedo, then it truly does look white. But yeah, it could be copious amounts of cigarette smoke that have stained and yellowed it. Yeah.
Watch enthusiasts that this was the watch of James Bond. There were actually two Rolexes on screen in
A lot of white
Goldfinger.
things from the
One
time
was the
ended
sub
up yellowed
worn
or
by
creamy
Connery.
looking, yes.
The other was a Rolex GMT Master, which was
Oh, my personal favorite. Of all the Rolexes, and really of wristwatches, I am quite fond of GMT watches. I like the ability to track multiple time zones. And I do have a couple of GMT watches in my collection. Again, if you're looking for a really cheap alternative and something that's super accurate, I know quartz watches seem seen as a bit lower class these days. They're not. They used to be, peak luxury items and the most expensive watches in the world compared to mechanical watches. And then prices just collapsed because they became so easy to manufacture. But again, Ver, really good watches with Ver, and they've got GMT watches very similar to what you see here, quartz movement and rotating bezel, date functionality, and you can get it in the classic Pepsi dial. And I think they also offer it in a Batman dial of black and light blue. And they've also got one that's just solid stainless steel bezel with black painted numbers.
Worn by Honor Blackman in her role as Pussy Galore. It was an appropriate watch for the character because Pussy Galore was actually a pilot and a leader of a squadron of flying lady pilots who had worked for the villain Goldfinger. The GMT Master was also a fairly new model at the time. They had all come out around 1953, 1954, the sub.
Yeah, the GMT Master was created by Rolex, sold, as we saw with the dial, at one point by Tiffany's, and quite often used by pilots of the first intercontinental and transatlantic flights, particularly those when the jet age was kicking off between New York's airport, between the original flights for Pan Am pilots on the Boeing 707 between JFK in New York and London's Heathrow. Casio quartz movements are still the most precise in the world. I love Casio watches. I have one that's called the Royale that I bought from SKX Mods. They recast the casing in solid stainless steel, gave it a brushed quality, gave it an improved quick-release bracelet that's easier to adjust with screw links rather than the weird push-pin links that Casio has on the original. Still has about 100 meters of water resistance, and then just also gave the swapped out the plasticky glass bit with an actual sapphire crystal glass, and just made it so much better. But they've also got some great analog watches too, Casio does. If you're looking for a really affordable watch, super precise, yes, agreed, Casio. Go for a Casio. You won't regret it. It's easy on the wallet, still looks the business, it'll last you for years. And still one of the few companies I know of out there that still guarantees a 10-year battery life on their quartz watches.
Mariner, the GMT Master, the Explorer, and it was a rare occurrence where both these classic models appeared in a James Bond movie. The GMT Master, worn by Pussy Galore, has since gone on to become nicknamed the Pussy Galore watch. The next movie in
probably because of the fact that it was from Tiffany's, but it's also named the Coke dial or Coke bezel. The red and black rotating bezel, mainly because it reminded people of a can of Coca-Cola.
1965 was Thunderball, and that is the movie where we're introduced to the Breitling Top Time. Connery was once again wearing the Rolex Submariner in this movie, but he also wore another watch. It was a Breitling Top Time, and in the movie, the watch was equipped with a Geiger counter that Bond used to track a cache of stolen nuclear weapons. In reality, the watch was a chronograph. I have a modern version of it on right now. It was a chronograph that was made by Breitling in the early 1960s, and
that's a really cool strap he's got, chat.
It was a chronograph.
You may see these from time to time. A leather strap with these little circular holes in it. That's for ventilation. But these are referred to as racing straps. These were the sort of wristwatch straps that would be used by racing drivers to make sure that they keep their wristwatches snug against their wrist, but also allowed to breathe. And quite often they would be wearing chronographs, a wristwatch with a stopwatch functionality to be able to track the lap times. That's what she said. What did I say?
That was made by
kind of like driving gloves. Yes, same basic concept, yeah. Ventilation to allow gripping of a surface, but still be able to breathe. Oh, the patterns of little holes, yeah. Oh, that's a chunky boy, yeah. No, the Breitling Top Time, that was a thick and chunky watch. It's a chunky boy, said the actress to the bishop.
By Breitling in the early 1960s and intended it for the growing cadre of motorsport enthusiasts and people who were into muscle cars and motorcycles and racing. And it was designed
to track the lap
to
times.
be a more youthful oriented tool watch. It made several memorable appearances on screen. In 1967, Connery made the last of his original run of James Bond film, You Only Live Twice. It took place largely in Japan. In this movie, we didn't see Connery wearing a Submariner. We saw him once again wearing a Gruen Precision 510, which was apparently the actor's own watch. I'm not sure why he went with only this watch in that movie, but there were no gadgets in it, and it pretty much served a subtle role as Bond's timepiece.
By that time, he wanted to do his own thing. Well, it's probably, his favorite watch. We've all got our favorite pair of shoes or a favorite shirt. Those of us who wear watches, we've got our favorite watches that we prefer to wear. Makes sense.
Diamonds Are Forever in 1971 was Sean Connery's last official appearance as James Bond. Eventually, he would do a movie called Never Say Never Again, which was basically a remake of Thunderball, which was not part of the official Bond canon.
Yes, unofficial.
All of which gets into a lot of legal wrangling that was going on at the time between Fleming's estate and the producers. Diamonds Are Forever is really the last time that we see Connery as part of the accepted Bond universe. And in this movie, the Gruen Precision 510 is once again back, and we do not see a Rolex Submariner. After Diamonds Are Forever, Connery was no longer interested in doing more James Bond movies and was probably aging out of the role. Thus, the search for a new...
He was getting old. Diamonds Are Forever, he had kind of let himself go a bit. He was getting a little bit fat. Even the director, Terence Young, said that he had quite a voracious appetite for food, didn't always exercise like he should, and by the time the 70s hit, he was starting to have a little bit of a dad bod. He still looked good, but he was showing his age, and he was not in the best of shape anymore.
Bond had to begin again. Chapter 3, The Lazenby Interlude. Now that Sean Connery had left the role of James Bond, the producers of the series were in an interesting position of having to fill his very, very impressive shoes, find a new actor to play 007. What was very unlikely was that an Australian model with very little acting experience would be the one to emerge as the next James Bond. But that
Lazenby absolutely bullshitted his way through the interviews. Got through with a lot of Aussie swagger. And it was only when he finally met the director of the film, Peter Hunt, that he basically said, "Mate, I've got no idea what the hell I'm doing. Never acted in a picture before. Don't know how any of this works. I'm going to need some help." And Peter Hunt said, "All right. Put you through your paces. We'll get you ready. We'll make this work." Very similar to what we saw with Sean Connery and Terence Young when they filmed Dr. No. It's like this is all the things they'd had to do before. Just doing it again, different people this time. And he got him ready. And he was damn good in this film. It's a pity that Lazenby got... I think the mistake was he was a bit too young in life for this sort of work. The fame went to his head. And he also got mixed up in the wrong crowd. with hippies and beatniks in the late 60s, and ultimately made the decision that he was going to try and build a film career off of one James Bond film. He thought that Bond films had sort of run their course and that they're not really going to be a thing for much longer. That turned out to be completely and totally wrong, and Lazenby was never able to match the success that he enjoyed with On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And it's a pity, because I always think what could have been had he humbled himself and said, yeah, you know what? I'll stay on. I'll keep doing this. Because the producers had made the mistake of not signing him to a multi-picture deal. He was only signed for one film because they didn't know if it was going to work out. So, had they not made that mistake and signed him to a multi-picture deal, contingent upon the films being a financial success, then how much more different the timeline would have been. We probably would have seen, my speculation is we would have seen Lazenby go on to star in Diamonds Are Forever, making it more of a direct sequel to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, incorporating a lot of the revenge plot that we saw in the book of You Only Live Twice, the hunting and eventually killing of Ernst Stavro Blofeld in a very brutal fashion. And we probably would have seen, it would not surprise me if we would have seen the Bond films be a bit darker and grittier in the 70s than they ultimately ended up being. The 70s Bond films, especially once Roger Moore became the star, took on a much light-hearted, much lighter tone, in some ways a bit comical and slapstick in some points. With Lazenby, he probably would have opted to go for something a bit grittier and probably would have pushed for something like that, which would also have fitted the times fairly well. But who knows, he probably could have played it a bit more lighthearted. He certainly had those humorous moments in On Her Majesty's Secret Service that were like that. So who knows? Things could have ended up being quite the same, except instead of Connery coming back, it would have been Lazenby and Diamonds Are Forever. And he would have stayed on throughout the 70s with starring in the films that would have been meant for Roger Moore. Live and Let Die, Man with a Golden Gun, The Spy Who Loved Me, Moonraker. Though I speculate he would have ultimately made the decision to make For Your Eyes Only his last film. That would have been the last film that I could see someone like Lazenby starting in. And then at that point, move over to Timothy Dalton for Octopussy, View to a Kill, Living Daylights, License to Kill. And then Brosnan taking up with GoldenEye.
A martini, shaken, not stirred.
Yes, I'll take a martini, shaken, not stirred. And just, the timeline continuing like normal. I think in an alternate universe, that's how it all would have worked out. With Roger Moore tragically never becoming James Bond, which would have been a bit sad, because even from the beginning, going back to Dr. No, the producers had considered Roger Moore as the first Bond actor. And even Ian Fleming said, yeah, Roger Moore, yeah, he'd be all right. Even Ian Fleming approved of Roger Moore. to a certain extent. Wasn't his first choice, but he's like, yeah, I could live with that. What could have been, chat? What could have been?
Exactly what happened. As the story goes, he met Cubby Broccoli in a barber shop and impressed him, but he had no acting experience to speak of. So he faked a resume to show to the producers. He went in and supposedly bought himself a Rolex Submariner of the same type that he had seen Connery wear in the movies.
He basically bought it on credit and he didn't have any way of paying it back. And the suit that he showed up into his audition was an Anthony Sinclair suit that had been tailored for Connery, but they never picked it up. And again, using money he did not have, he bought that suit and wore it to the audition.
To help impress the people he was auditioning for. He also wore a suit, a very Connery-like, Bond-like suit that Connery himself had apparently ordered but never picked up. How he was able to do this is fairly unclear.
It was a different time in Britain back in the 60s. It was back when we were still a proper country. And still a relatively high-trust society. Well, that's really the shortest answer we can give, is that it was a different time, and Britain was a high-trust society, and London itself was still a safe place to be.
But long story short, he did manage to impress the casting team enough that he was cast as James Bond in the next movie, which was 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. It was one of the most significant Bond movies, despite the fact that George Lazenby would never do another one after this. From a watch standpoint, he was fairly similar to Connery. He did wear a Submariner, probably the same one that he had brought to that legendary audition. But he also wore a chronograph from Rolex, which we now call a Rolex Daytona. But if you're really into Rolex, it was a Rolex pre-Daytona because it had...
Reference 6238. Yeah, I remember seeing that. We were actually had a screening in the Castle Rexworth Discord of this particular film about a couple of weeks ago now. And yeah, it was one of the first times I really took notice in that one scene of, oh wait, that's a Rolex Daytona, isn't it? No, it turns out it was pre-Daytona. He had a Rolex chronograph.
Had come out in the years before the watch had acquired that nickname. To my knowledge, it's the only time that a Rolex Daytona was ever seen on screen in a Bond movie. With George Lazenby out and Sean Connery out, it was now time to find a third James Bond. Chapter 4, the Roger Moore era.
This is where it gets interesting.
In the early 1970s, there was another search for a new James Bond, and this one landed on English actor Roger Moore, who brought a slightly more polished, elegant feel to the character.
He had already built that vibe with two different cities that he had done for ITV in Britain, exported worldwide. The first was The Saint in the 1960s. Long-running adaptation of the Leslie Charteris novels. And then he had one more very short one-year series that he did called The Persuaders. Where he played a member of the upper crust of British society, Lord Brett Sinclair. And it was kind of a light-hearted affair. It's classified as a comedy series. He co-starred alongside Tony Curtis. And really good show. It's still available, I think, on streaming some parts of the world. Definitely still on DVD. Which if you can get it, I think it's also on Blu-ray in the UK and in Europe. Get it on Blu-ray; it looks even better that way. Really a fun show. The acting between Tony Curtis and Roger Moore, fantastic. They're really funny, very, very witty, very charming, both of them. Back when ITV still made proper international shows, they filmed in some of those beautiful locations around the world. And costume design credit actually went to Roger Moore. He designed his own wardrobe. And they also drove some of the coolest cars. Tony Curtis had that the Ferrari Dino, and Roger Moore had this bright racing yellow Aston Martin DBS. They both of them just look so damn cool.
Less rough around the edges maybe than Connery, and he was
Really
a new Bond
polished.
for a new era. The era was also changing drastically for the world of watches, and
Yeah, Moore's portrayal of James Bond was quite often seen as probably the most charming Bond of them all. Even some of his female co-stars quite frequently said, you knew this was James Bond. You knew he was going to just love you and leave you in the end. But Moore's portrayal of Bond always made you feel like he might actually marry you. You fall in love with him so much that you actually believe he might marry you. Which that's always a bit of charm that's always inspired me. And I've always found Roger Moore's portrayal of James Bond to be one of my personal favorites. And honestly, Roger Moore, both the actor and his portrayals of both James Bond and Simon Templar, the Saint, and as Lord Brett Sinclair, major inspiration for the VTuber character of Lord Rexworth.
this would really significantly have an impact on the watches that we would see James
Yeah, we're entering more of a modernist era. This is when the first quartz watches came on the market, courtesy of this company here, Seiko, in the late 1960s. It was a model called the Seiko Astron. They recently revived the Astron brand, except they've added GPS technology. And so it's made a comeback. They've added in GPS technology for further accuracy. I think it's accurate down to the second. Only loses like 1 to 5 seconds every 1,000 years, 100,000 years theoretically. But yeah, this is when quartz watches and especially digital watches were still expensive luxury toys. Connery wearing his own watch reminds me of Joe Montaigne using his personal firearm in Criminal Minds. I did not know that he did that. That is interesting.
Bond wearing in these movies that came out in the 70s and in the 80s. The watch industry was experiencing what we now refer to as the quartz crisis. This was a result of the development of quartz battery-powered movements that were able to make watches run more efficiently and also make them cheaper. Companies like Seiko and Citizen and Casio from Japan and others from the East were adopting this quartz technology and really kind of taking over the market with these newer, cheaper timepieces, which eventually would lead to more complicated, high-tech digital timepieces. All of this would have an impact on the James Bond movies, but not right away. The first Roger Moore movie was Live and Let Die in 1973, which was actually based on the second Fleming novel. Moore was wearing a Rolex Submariner, a reference 5513. The Rolex Submariner in that movie had a couple of functions. One of them was a magnet that Bond used to unzip a lady's dress, which was kind of an indication of the type of Bond that Roger Moore was going to portray in the 70s.
Sheer magnetism, darling.
There was another watch worn in the famous speedboat chase scene in Live and Let Die that many, even very knowledgeable Bond watch enthusiasts are unaware of. And it was a watch much like this one, a Tissot PR516.
Oh, that's a nice one. Yeah, chat, if you want a really nice Swiss watch, but you don't want to spend a fortune, look at a Tissot. They're good. They're really good. As a matter of fact, they've got a really nice GMT watch, quartz powered. And I think a lot of their quartz watches, they're not cheap. They're, certainly not in the $200 range. It's more, you're going to spend more like $500, but they're nice. Really good quality. And again, one of those things that, you could look at it as like an heirloom piece.
And as far as we know, it's the only Tissot that's ever been in a Bond movie. And the speculation has been that it was Roger Moore's own Tissot watch. Most importantly, for our discussion about the evolution of James Bond's wristwear in the 1970s, Live and Let Die ushered in the era of the digital watch in James Bond movies. Roger Moore wore a Hamilton Pulsar, of which this is a modern revival in the current collection. It was the
they still make Hamilton Pulsars, and they still make them very similar to the one you saw in Live and Let Die. It's a good one. It's a good one.
First LED digital watch, originally out in 1970 and originally available only in gold. It was a fairly simple watch at the time. The technology hadn't really advanced. Much like this one, it had a quiet digital face until you activated the pusher on the side and it showed red digital numerals. The original Hamilton Pulsar from the 1970s was actually a very expensive watch. We don't picture digital watches today as being that, but it was...
Yeah, today we view them as rather cheap, chintzy little things. Back then, they were luxury items. These were toys of the well-off.
It was quite a luxury product at the time. Initially, it was available only in gold, and eventually it became available in steel. We actually get a really good shot of the Hamilton Pulsar in the darkness, where we see the red digital numerals pop up. Moore's second movie and the follow-up to Live and Let Die was 1974's The Man with the Golden Gun. This one was another movie where Moore wore a Rolex Submariner, and in this movie it wasn't equipped with gadgets. Moore's Rolex in The Man with the Golden Gun pretty much served strictly as a timekeeper. This movie, generally not a favorite of enthusiasts. It's got a lot of interesting facts associated with it because as a novel, it was published after Fleming's death, and word is that Fleming never really finished it in the sense that he never had gone through his editing process. So it was a bit more raw as a novel. So
yeah, Fleming would add a lot of the detail and flourishes in second and third drafts. Unfortunately, he never got around to that process with The Man with the Golden Gun. And so it was left to, I think, ghostwriters like Kingsley Amis to work all of that out. And they weren't really able to replicate the style of Ian Fleming. And so that one just always has had a different feel to it in terms of the writing.
Maybe the source material itself was a little bit holding it back. Other trivia associated with the movie is that Christopher Lee, who played the villain Scaramanga, the titular man with the golden gun in the movie, was related to Ian Fleming. He was a step cousin, and he used to golf with Fleming, and allegedly was even offered the role of Dr. No in the first movie. That was...
Now, see, I've always heard different. I've heard he was actually considered for the part of James Bond. So that's interesting that he would be considered for Dr. No, which he would have been epic as Dr. No. But as any Bond villain, I could even see Sir Christopher Lee in chat. Tell me if I'm mad. Can you imagine Sir Christopher Lee as Ernst Stavro Blofeld? I think that would have been brilliant. What could have been?
Ultimately played by Joseph Wiseman. The Man with the Golden Gun was not a huge success as far as these movies go, but it set the stage for the next one, which was one of the biggest blockbusters of its time. That was The Spy Who Loved Me in 1977.
Brilliant
So the
film.
digital era, which was teased at in the previous movie, was starting to make its presence felt in this one, because the other watch that James Bond wore was a Seiko 0674LC.
I don't think Seiko makes anything like this anymore. Nothing that's really widely available. If you want something similar to what you see here, chat, you're going to have to go with a Casio, but that's all right, because Casio still makes fantastic digital quartz watches. And don't let anybody tell you that a digital quartz watch is somehow a nerdy or dorky or lame looking sort of watch, because if it's good enough for Roger Moore as James Bond, it's good enough for you, me, or anyone else. And let's face it, this does still look cool. And I will fight anyone who says otherwise.
In a scene that probably looks pretty low-tech now, high-tech at the time, that watch
still looks cool.
Printed out a ticker tape message for Bond to report to M.
Oh, that's cool,
about
man.
The most impressive thing that it did. But it was a basic digital watch, but it also might have marked the beginning of watch product placement in the James Bond movies. Product placement wasn't really a thing in the 1960s when the movies started, and as I've said before, Rolex would never have given them a watch to use without any kind of special agreement like that. So Seiko is listed as a partner in the credits in this movie, and we'd see Seiko in future ones as well. There was another big hit movie in 1977.
Yeah, and one more thing before we keep going, chat. Seiko as a brand, really good. They've been trying to go a bit upmarket in recent years. So a lot of their more affordable offerings are no longer as affordable. And a lot of their items in the Seiko 5 stable, which is a bit more entry level, they have cut some corners with those. Not a big fan of that. Though you can still modify and find mods and modded watches using Seikos as a base. But still, absolutely fantastic watches. And I've long been a huge fan of Seikos. I've got a really fantastic dive watch from Seiko that's based off of the ones that they made back in, I think it was 1965, one of their first big attempts at making a dive watch. It looks absolutely fantastic. It's probably one of my nicest looking watches, and it's one of those that, yeah, you can dress down, dress up, goes with just about anything, and looks just as good, if not maybe even a little bit better than anything Rolex can offer today.
Called Star Wars, and that movie would have a large impact in 1977. Future ones as well. There was another big hit movie in 1977 called Star Wars, and that movie would have a large impact on what would be the next James Bond movie, 1979's Moonraker. The filmmakers decided to take futuristic
Bond in
high-tech
space.
spin on it. James Bond in Space Adventure is pretty much how everybody remembers that movie. And appropriately, it would also be a movie where high-tech watches would take the stage solely. It was the first movie where James Bond wore only Seikos. One of the ones that Moore wore for this movie was an M534 Seiko memory bank calendar.
Yeah, this is when you were starting to get into the era of digital watches that could do more than just tell the time. Before we had Apple Watches and Samsung smartwatches, you had companies like Seiko and Casio that were taking quartz watch technology, going digital with it, giving you not just the time down to the second, but giving you perpetual calendar functionality, being able to tell the day of the week, the month, the date, even the year. You could have important dates, appointments, and everything set into a calendar memory bank. Stopwatch functionality, timer functionality. Eventually, Casio would come up with a world timer functionality, tracking most of the major time zones in the world, and being able to track about 4 different time zones with the push of the button, especially with the Royale. Alarm functionality, so you could have a watch wake you up with constant beeping. And you could even set multiple alarms. What else could they do? And then at one point you had Casio introducing the calculator watch, which was not just able to tell the time, day of the week, date functionality, had a calculator in it, had a memory bank that you could store. I think it had a stopwatch and timer functionality too. It had alarms you could set. They weren't smartwatches as we know them today, but they were really smart watches. Jess, welcome back. Good to see you. And No Name Brand, thank you for staying with us. The Seiko G757 Sports 100 came with a compass, amongst other features. Yes, you also had watches around this time being introduced with compass functionality. So it used to be... So yeah, you also had Explorer-style field watches with rotating bezels that, yeah, you could use them like a compass. The Casio AE1200WH came with a compass and a time zone map that showed you latitude and longitude. Yes, I've got a variation of the AE1200. It doesn't have the compass or the latitude and longitude, but it does have the world timer functionality, the stopwatch, timer, alarms, date, perpetual calendar, and tracks the days of the week. Oh, and this was also around the time that they came up with, that a lot of these companies were coming up with illuminated watch faces. So you press one of these buttons up in the corner, and it would light up the screen for you. And it wasn't terribly bright, but in pitch black, it could shine like a beacon. And, yeah, kind of glows in the dark. Vaguely remembered a documentary 2 decades ago which mentioned a wristwatch made specifically for spy plane pilots, which could be plugged into a cockpit outlet. That wouldn't surprise me. A lot of the major functionalities that we see with a lot of classical analog watches. A lot of that came out of military and sport purposes, and ultimately drove demand and sales for those same watches. Because, if a soldier is wearing some type of watch that's designed specifically for airmen or for people on land, or, there's a specific type of diver's watch that is authorized for use by a country's military, it's going to be a sales driver for that company, because civilians are going to want to get their hands on those watches as well, because, they want to be cool. They want to be cool like the boys going into a fight for them. When I was in the army, everybody wore Casio G-Shocks. Yes. G-Shocks and, damn, what was that other one? There was another particular brand. Shit, what is it? It's not Hamilton. I don't think they use Hamiltons all that much anymore. We got a lot of people using G-Shocks, Timexes. That was another one. I'm told that some American Navy divers prefer to use Scurfers in titanium for their dive watches. It's actually a smart looking watch. Only about $400 US, so very reasonably priced. Uses a Ronda quartz movement. Battery life spent good for 5 years. Yeah, really good. A lot of people prefer it in Seikos. Marathon. That's another one. A lot of people don't know about that one, but Marathon Navigators, I think they're still quite popular, especially amongst the American military. It's a bit odd because I think they're made in Canada, but, probably best not to think too deep on that one. And then occasionally you've got some old school types like that prefer the Hamilton khaki field. It would adjust to match information from the aircraft dials and meters, etc., and would adjust to match latitude and speed from the pilot when the pilot connected the watch by wire to the electronics. It was absolutely crazy to me then. Yeah, there were some. I know Seiko had certain memory bank watches that would plug into what was basically a small handheld miniature computer, and you work the database functionality that way. Absolutely crazy to me then, because this was Cold War era wristwatches. Yeah, it's incredible what they came up even back then. Nowadays, so many things are so streamlined, and you just connect your watch to your phone, and that's how you make all that work. Craziest feature I've had in a wristwatch was a small inbuilt antenna you could pull out on the miniaturized electronics from a walkie-talkie. This was over 10 years ago. My father used to take me and my brothers to various ham radio conventions with various companies in southern Germany. I think I've heard of that, of wristwatches being equipped with radios. Haven't really heard much about walkie-talkie functionality, though. That wouldn't surprise me. It's fairly simple enough to miniaturize. The range is probably not all that great, but yeah. And I mean, Seiko, they've come up with watches that I think have like FM radios built in. I know at one point it was even featured in Octopussy. There was a Seiko watch that you plug in this little bit that's connected by a wire to the top of the watch face, and that wire feeds over to this little kind of pocket handheld bit of electronic gizwidgetry that you can slip in a coat pocket, and that bit that you put in the coat pocket has got AM/FM radio, and it's also got a television tuner to it. So you could turn your Seiko watch into a portable television. I thought that was just the coolest thing. They're fun playthings. Looked like regular wristwatch, except we could tune around and talk to each other. Yeah, you sort of felt like Dick Tracy or like the crew of the Enterprise in Star Trek. Oh, Prince Wacker, welcome in. A 15 stream streak. Congratulations, sir. All right, let's keep going with the video, yeah?
In the movie, it was used as a remote detonator. In real life, it had this kind of oddball function of a calendar that could remember any date all the way up to the somewhat random endpoint of 2009. As we're now on the cusp of the 1980s, it's interesting to see how
Only go up to 2009,
watch technology was evolving, and we will see more of that as the watch world and the Bond movie franchise moves into the 80s. In anticipation of the release of Moonraker, Seiko even made a TV advertisement for the watch featuring scenes of James Bond from the movie.
Oh, here it is. Yeah. This is one of Seiko's first calculator watches. And these little bits down here, chat, are the number buttons and the function buttons to, do sums and subtraction and multiplication and division. I think this right here is supposed to be a small grill for the speaker. So I think it could beep out. You possibly even speak out the numbers. Possibly. I don't know. Could be wrong about that. But yeah, one of the very first calculator watches. They weren't really buttons that you could press with your fingers because you would frequently get the fat finger problem. One of those things where I think you had to have like a pen or a pencil to press in the numbers to get that to work.
Sign that watches and movie making were starting to get more involved and that James Bond was being used to sell watches. It's also interesting that the first time we see James Bond in a watch commercial, it's not for a Rolex, it's not for an Omega, it's for
Seiko.
Rather humble but very cool Seiko digital watch. Roger Moore returned again in 1981's For Your Eyes
cool.
Only, and in this movie he was wearing multiple watches from Seiko. One of
this
them
was a good one.
Was a
there's only like a handful of movies that I think are really my personal favorites of the Roger Moore era. The Spy Who Loved Me is one of them at the top. Man with the Golden Gun, I like it. A lot of people don't really like it. I like it. I think it's a decent film. But For Your Eyes Only, I think that was when they really, really hit their stride. I mean, they did an absolute bang-up job with The Spy Who Loved Me. But so much of that just continued on and was just polished to perfection with For Your Eyes Only.
Rather historical dive watch from Seiko, which was nicknamed the Golden Tuna, as you can see from the...
Yeah, this is the Seiko Tuna. Quite an iconic dive watch from Seiko. This is a deep sea diving watch, which you can tell from its construction with all of these external screws and this extra casing and really tight big crown on it. Also the fact that it's good to take down as deep as 600 meters. Normally dive watches are good for about 100, 200 meters. Usually that's kind of the sweet spot for dive watches. But then when you start to get into 500, 600 meters, that's more for deep sea saturation type diving. And yeah, both Seiko and Rolex, pioneers in both. Seiko coming up with this really tough utilitarian type watch, which was nicknamed the Tuna, because it looks like a really over-engineered can of tuna. And then the Golden Tuna because of the shiny gold bits here.
Odd tuna can shaped case. This watch was significant for Seiko in its history because it was one of the first compressor dive watches that was built to withstand helium buildup inside a diving bell. Watch companies had addressed this problem, especially Rolex, with their Sea Dweller model, but all those watches had used a different solution. They had used a built-in helium release valve that screwed into the case to release the buildup so the case and crystal wouldn't pop open.
Yeah, and that little bit would just sort of pop out as you would both descend and ascend. And then you just pop it back in and you keep going because it would adjust to the atmosphere. Seiko did a little bit different.
Seiko chose a different technological route to that. They actually just built a case that was really, really strong and waterproof to 600 meters. And
they just built it better. They're just like, okay, what exists is not really cutting the mustard anymore. So we'll just make something even better. And they did.
And this watch followed Roger Moore into an important scene in the movie. We also start to see a bit of the analog era start to creep back in because Roger Moore also wears an analog digital Seiko in this movie, which is...
Yeah, this is also around the time you started seeing hybrid watches like this coming in. I don't think Seiko really has anything like this on offer anymore on the market. This is still a really cool watch that we're looking at here. I love the military time functionality here around the analog portion. Still driven by a quartz movement, which is really good. I think originally they started out as you could have as just tracking a single time zone. So whatever you see on the analog portion, you would see it duplicated here on the digital portion. And then you might have some extra functionalities like timer, stopwatch, alarms. But at one point, I think Casio still has some watches like this on the market, even today. You have digital clock and then the analog portion operating independently of each other. So you can track multiple time zones and have them on display. Sort of an alternative take on GMT functionality.
Called a duo display, displaying the time in two different methods. It would be an early harbinger of a swing back to a more traditional watch for 007, but not quite yet. With Octopussy in 1983, the 80s were in full swing, and so was the digital era of watchmaking. One of the craziest Seiko watches made its appearance in this movie, on the wrist, once again, of Roger Moore. This is an actual period-specific model of the long-gone Seiko TV watch.
Yeah, this one, it's really over the top in terms of tech, but you see what I mean, chat. It's got digital display for the time and for the timer, probably a countdown timer and a stopwatch, alarm functionality. But this right here, this was a television screen. Again, you hooked up the TV and radio tuner, which you'd keep in a pocket somewhere, and then a wire would connect to these contact points up here. And then you'd have a television, a portable television, on your wrist. Carolyn Bouquet was also gorgeous in that movie. Yes, she really was. She's actually, I think, probably a highly underrated Bond girl. But yes, she was gorgeous. Yeah, unfortunately, the watches themselves have not really stood the test of time, because so much of the tech has just deteriorated and failed. But also, changing standards for television broadcasting have rendered watches like this completely obsolete. You have to remember that the TV tuners that would be compatible with watches like this were designed for picking up analog television broadcasts. Well, the entire world has gone digital, has converted over to HD, and in some places, I think even 4K television, or they're working on it. I know NHK in Japan is experimenting with 8K and even 16K television broadcasts. But with the switch from analog to digital and from standard def to high definition, the television tuner for this watch can no longer pick up any sort of TV channels. So it's useless. All you're going to get is just snowy picture. So, bit sad that part. But still, this is pretty cool tech, I have to say.
Roger Moore wore this watch both for business and pleasure in Octopussy. He used it on his mission, and he also used it to leer at women on the tiny little screen.
Back when you could get away with that sort of thing.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. At the time, this watch was in the Guinness Book of World Records as
Yeah, you see a little bit of it. This right here is the TV tuner. Again, it was shaped very much like, I mean, it was effectively just a pocket radio with a built-in VHF and UHF tuner.
having the smallest ever TV screen, like 1 inch and a fourth. The watch did not last that long on the market. It was a hit because of its novelty, but the picture quality was really bad, and it needed a battery pack, and...
Yeah, that's another thing. Needed its own... This also was a battery pack to power the television. And usually with portable televisions back in those days, basically, unless you were using just your standard portable tape player, Walkman, or, you know, pocket radio, something like that, anything that required television functionality, that was going to use up batteries just like they were going out of style.
An antenna and just lots and lots of extras to go with it. It was not as simple as Roger Moore made it look in the movie. Seiko also made an advertisement for the TV watch, which aired on regular TV, and it showed scenes from the movie once again as the
Though it is possible, if you had that watch, you could watch those commercials for that watch on the Seiko TV watch. Might as well buy a Trinitron portable television set. Well, I mean, a lot of people did. It is like, why settle for a tiny little screen on your Seiko watch when we could have when we could have a Sony TV Walkman, which was a thing. Sony's Walkman division came up with portable television sets. And not so much in the 80s, but at least in the early to mid 90s, that was the trendy bit of tech to have back in those days, along with, you know, a fairly thick, chunky, almost brick-sized cell phone, or, you know, a car phone. If you had those items, you were a person of means. You were a rather wealthy person who could afford expensive toys like that. The Pocket Vision 25 pocket television, small enough to fit in a pocket, produced in the 1980s, looked like a glorified calculator with a bigger screen. That's pretty cool.
Previous commercial had done. A View to a Kill in 1985 was the final bow for Roger Moore as James Bond, and it was the final bow for Seiko as the official Bond watch.
Yeah. A View to a Kill. Roger Moore definitely showing his age. By this time, he'd had a lot of plastic surgery done to make himself look younger. But he was really getting long in the tooth. And he knew it was time for him to go when one of the Bond girls that he was supposed to be romancing was about the same age as one of his daughters. that really gave him the ick. Him being a man in his late 50s by this time, pushing 60. He just figured, yeah, you know what? It's time to go. He had considered making For Your Eyes Only his last Bond film, and that would have been a fantastic film to go out on because it was really good. But 1983, producers knew that a rival film with Sean Connery, Never Say Never Again, was being made, remake of Thunderball. So they offered more, a lot more money to stay on. And he said, okay, I'll do, one or two more. They had thought about wanting to get Timothy Dalton or maybe Pierce Brosnan to star in the films, but Timothy Dalton had made the mistake of accepting a role in an adaptation of the comic series Brenda Starr, which was trapped in production and development hell for years. Finally got released. It starred both him and a young Brooke Shields. Wasn't very successful, I don't think. But the constant production delays with that kept him from signing on as James Bond. Pierce Brosnan was also considered for the part around this time, but he was starring in a American television show, a detective show on NBC called Remington Steele. And I think they were originally going to cancel it after season 3, maybe season 4, but they kept picking it up. And finally, season 5 was just a series of TV movies, but even that kept getting delayed and also kept him from accepting the part. So ultimately, Dalton became available, and that's how he starred as Bond in Living Daylights.
Roger Moore wore at least 3 Seikos. There was an analog date watch, there was an analog quartz chronograph, and another version of the Golden Tuna that had both an analog and a digital display.
It's kind of like a prototype version of the Seiko Arnie.
Quartz chronograph was somewhat significant, as it was the first quartz analog chronograph. That was another innovation that Seiko could take pride in.
Yeah, it used to be. They were all mechanical.
Toward the end of the movie, there's a climactic battle between Bond and the villain played by Christopher Walken on the Golden Gate Bridge. In that scene, Moore looks to be wearing a Rolex Datejust. And discussion has cropped up over the years over what that watch actually is, how it got in the movie. Was it Moore's own watch? But it's more likely that it's probably a Seiko that looked like a Datejust. With Seiko being an official partner of the films at this stage, that's probably the more likely thing, which would make the Submariner and GMT Master and Lazenby's pre-Daytona still the only Rolex watches that have been in the James Bond movies. A View to a Kill was Roger Moore's last James Bond movie, and the search for a new Bond was on again. Chapter 5, Timothy Dalton's Bond. As the 80s were drawing to a close, there was a long and exhaustive search for the next actor to play James Bond. The role was actually offered to Pierce Brosnan, who was on TV at the time playing a suave detective called Remington Steele. Many who watched that show saw him as a natural to take over the role of James Bond. Unfortunately, NBC, who made Remington Steele and had Pierce Brosnan under contract, did not allow him out of that contract to go and make the movies. So
they knew they had a hot property, and they were not going to share it with anyone else, much to the consternation and frustration of Pierce Brosnan. And some would argue in many ways it kind of soured the attitude that Brosnan had towards the role, towards the crew, and even towards some of his co-stars. It's rumored that both him and Stephanie Zimbalist didn't exactly get on very well during production of Remington Steele. Very similar to what we've heard about the strained relations between Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd with a rival television show on ABC called Moonlighting. That one got so bad that neither of them could stand to be in the same room with each other, even filming at the same time. I don't think it ever got that bad between Brosnan and Zimbalist, but yeah, there were allegedly the rumors were that they didn't get on very well off screen. Fairly decent chemistry on screen, but yeah, and especially by the time they were getting close to the 4th and 5th seasons, Brosnan was just so fed up with NBC and with the showrunners for Remington Steele that he wasn't turning in his best performances. He just kind of acted not his best and like he wanted to be anywhere else. He was a man who recognized his value and wanted to do greater things. Trouble was, the people he worked for also recognized his value and wanted to keep him locked in place so they could keep extracting that value out of him. And production of motion pictures and television shows back then were quite different from the way they are now, to where it wasn't so easy for someone to appear both in a television show and in films quite often at the same time, but in roughly the same short time frame as each other.
Anyone who wanted to see Pierce Brosnan in that role would have to wait for a while before they would actually see it happen. They finally landed on Welsh actor Timothy Dalton for the role of Bond, who was really playing kind of a tougher, grimmer, and more no-nonsense Bond, more brooding, a little bit more hardened by life.
More like the
though
novels.
Still with those classic characteristics that we associate with Bond. The eye.
Yeah, Dalton was... When he got the role, he went back and reread all the novels to really get the feel for Bond. And he wanted to play it as close to the novels as he could get away with. And I would argue that without his portrayal of James Bond in the late 80s, we would never have gotten the grittier performances by people like Daniel Craig later on.
For the ladies, the taste for martinis. It was very different. Not everybody loved the choice. Much like now, it's hard to find everyone to agree. But the first Timothy Dalton movie, The Living Daylights in 1987, did very, very well.
Really good.
There was also an entirely new watch on James Bond's wrist in this movie, and it was the Tag Heuer Night Diver. At the time, this watch was never really seen all that clearly on screen, which is why it's been fairly recent that sharp-eyed watch enthusiasts have discovered it. It's so unclear.
It's due to the fact that Bond films are now available in high definition. You started to see it when they came out on Blu-ray, but especially now that you've got them, I think, in 4K, a lot more of these details are available to us that never were before.
Here on screen, in fact, that we don't know whether the logo said Tag Heuer, as the current one does, or the original plain Heuer. Because, as it happens, as this movie was being made, the original Heuer company was being taken over by Technique d'Avant-Garde, which was the company that was initialed Tag. There were watches with both logos still on the racks, so we really don't know which one the filmmakers used. There were in fact other Tag Heuer watches spotted on other characters in that movie, including the villain, so it's possible that Tag Heuer had some kind of relationship with the movie, though it's never been plainly stated that they did. 2 years after The Living Daylights, in 1989, came Dalton's second and final movie called License to Kill, a reference to James Bond's 007 number. So the plot of License to Kill is fairly low stakes as far as Bond movies go. It's Bond versus a drug cartel. He's not saving the world or blowing up Blofeld's space laser or anything like that. Again, not generally a favorite of a lot of Bond fans, and it was also the last appearance in a Bond movie of a Rolex Submariner. Timothy Dalton wore a Submariner date, reference 16610, and his stunt double wore a slightly different Submariner. And the stunt double's watch was actually probably more valuable at auction for watch collectors because it was the watch that was actually used in, rough and tumble action scenes in the movie and showed the scars.
Interesting.
Timothy Dalton was finished with the role of James Bond, and it would be 6 years before we'd see James Bond on screen again.
Yeah, he was... They were originally, after License to Kill had wrapped, they were working on a third film that he had every intention of starting in. Tentatively, they were going to call it Property of a Lady, which is one of the few book or short story titles that still has not been used as a film title. You did see reference to Property of a Lady in Octopussy, but it's never been a formal film title. And so a lot of them, and a lot of the elements of that particular Bond film that they were working on ultimately would be kind of scrapped and reused for Tomorrow Never Dies. But originally, they had intended on making another film for Timothy Dalton to star in. I think they were going to release it around 1991. Give them about 2 years in between that film and License to Kill. Unfortunately, MGM United Artists and the whole Bond catalog and Aeon Productions, there was legal battles and entanglements, and all of that did not get resolved until the mid-90s. And during that time, Dalton was signed almost exclusively to them, to where he said, "Look, I've got to go out and get work. I have expenses to pay. I've got bills to pay. So I can't really wait for all of this to be resolved. I need to be let out of my contract." And the producers were understanding about it. They had no idea when any of that was going to get resolved. It ended up being tied up in the courts for years. And so they did let him out of the contract. And so License to Kill was his last film. But then, paved the way by that time for an older, wiser Pierce Brosnan to come in and play the part. And for a lot of us 90s kids, growing up, Pierce Brosnan, he was our Bond. And he was damn good, too. I remember seeing the first Tag Heuer chronographs being worn by the bad guys in Die Hard 2. Oh, yeah, that's right. They were wearing tags, weren't they? Yeah.
Chapter 6, the Pierce Brosnan era. James Bond disappeared from movie screens for a long time, and it wasn't certain he was ever coming back. Part of it was a lawsuit that was going on between MGM and Eon Productions over the ownership of the property. It was a real discussion as to whether James Bond's time had passed. Fortunately, the lawsuit was resolved, and there were still James Bond movies to be made. And this time, the filmmakers could actually get Pierce Brosnan for the next movie, which would be 1995's GoldenEye. GoldenEye was actually the name of Ian Fleming's house in Jamaica. And in the movie, it was used for the space weapon that everyone was after, especially the villain played by Sean Bean.
Sean Bean was fantastic as 006. GoldenEye, to my knowledge, I think is still open to the public as like an open-air museum. I think it's still owned by the estate of Ian Fleming, but I think it's been turned into a small museum of sorts. So you can actually, I think, go visit GoldenEye if you're ever in Jamaica. And you can see the very desk and typewriter that Ian Fleming worked off of when he was writing the Bond novels.
Brosnan was the new James Bond in GoldenEye, and the new James Bond had a brand new watch, and this watch was an Omega Seamaster Diver, much like the one I have here. The story behind how Bond came to wear an Omega Seamaster is kind of an interesting one. Omega is the Swiss watch company that officially partnered with the studios making the Bond films in 1995, becoming the official first watch of James Bond. Seiko, despite doing product placement, never really touted that as a title. But Omega...
Yeah, they probably didn't even know how. But yeah, around the 90s, product placement starting to become a very big thing and critical point for advertisements. The Omega Seamaster, also the watch of choice for Prince William. It was actually a gift to him when he was a teenager by his mother, the late Diana, Princess of Wales.
Has had a long-running relationship, and it continues to this day. How Omega tells the story is that costume designer Lindy Hemming, who came on board with Brosnan to do the wardrobe in GoldenEye, suggested that James Bond, who was a former Navy man, a former naval intelligence officer, would wear a dive watch like the Seamaster.
Yeah, a lot of people may not know it. You know, it's one of those small details that you only pick up on occasionally. But James Bond is actually a commissioned officer in the Royal Navy. He holds the rank of commander. In fact, in the John Gardner series of novels, he actually gets a promotion up to captain. Occasionally you'll see it in the films where they refer to him as Commander Bond. And I know you only live twice.
SRSPRJ just followed on Kick.
SRSPRJ, thank you for the follow. Occasionally you'll hear references like in You Only Live Twice, I think The Spy Who Loved Me, and also, I don't think it was GoldenEye, but Tomorrow Never Dies. You see Bond in full military dress, and he has the commander's stripes on his jacket, on his sleeves.
Brosnan saw the watch, liked the watch a lot, especially the blue dial. It was actually a quartz watch. It was the Seamaster 300.
I think Omega still makes a quartz version of the Seamaster. It's... Omegas are obscenely expensive. They are as expensive, in many ways, even more expensive than some Rolexes. And if you get one, it may very well be the only watch you ever buy. It's also the only watch you ever need, really, because it's just... it's an heirloom timepiece at this stage. But yeah, I think they might still have a quartz Seamaster in their stable. If you can find an older used one, definitely get it. They're good watches. And, Omega being owned by the Swatch Group, they've got access to some of the best Swiss quartz movements in the world. Because I think they own Etta, I believe. It's Etta that they own. I think it's Salita and Ronda that are still the independent ones. Beautiful color scheme on that watch with the silver and the steel blue. Oh, absolutely. And I love the multi-link bracelet. You've got with, tiny little bits of polish on some of the smaller links, and everything else is matted or brushed stainless steel. Yeah, fantastic watch.
Meter reference 2451. In the movie, it was equipped with several gadgets, including a laser beam that was operated by twisting the bezel. Also a remote detonator for an explosive device. Both of these were added to the watch by Q Branch in the movie. They were put to good use by Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. Omega leaned into the relationship with Bond heavily from very early on, producing a TV commercial with footage from GoldenEye to sell the Omega Seamaster. And it was the start of a very long and fruitful advertising and marketing relationship between Omega and the Bond movie series. The video game
They've done
based
very
on
well for
GoldenEye
themselves.
was just an earth-shakingly popular game at the time. Culturally, it was very significant, and it helped catapult Brosnan's Bond, as well as the Omega and other elements from that movie, even larger into the public consciousness. If you pause the game GoldenEye, you can very clearly see a watch that is modeled very much after the Omega Seamaster. 2 years after GoldenEye came Tomorrow Never Dies, Brosnan's second movie. Brosnan was very enamored of the blue-dialed Omega Seamaster that he wore and made famous in
Absolutely.
GoldenEye, and he wore another version of that watch in the next movie. This
Yeah, they made slight alterations over the years, but the Seamaster that you see in GoldenEye differs radically from, what you see in World Is Not Enough, Die Another Day, even into the Daniel Craig era of films. Favorite plush watch has always been the Cartier Ballon Bleu. Just a fraction out of my price range, however, might put that money towards a house first. Yes, put it towards a house first, definitely. Watches are nice little toys once you've paid all the bills, gotten yourself out of debt and staying out of debt and building retirement, and yeah, don't do like me and make the mistake of splurging on a whole bunch of watches when you probably should have been putting that towards your retirement. That takes me back, detonating mines with the watch. We were eating good in terms of Q branch gadgetry with the Brosnan era of Bond films. They came up with some of the coolest gadgets, and a lot of them integrated into the Amiga watches that Bond used.
This one, however, reflecting the move that the watch industry was making from quartz back into more sophisticated luxury mechanicals, he wore a Seamaster with a mechanical movement. This one,
and in many ways, it's great that they are perfecting mechanical watch movements and that they have over the past few decades. But watch technology really did peak with the quartz movement. Nothing else has been able to come close. Nothing else is as accurate. It may not necessarily have a lot of the soul and artistry that you would find with mechanical movements. I think a lot of that is just really pretension and marketing hype. Because in the end, why do you wear a wristwatch? To tell the time. And naturally, you wanted to tell the time in the most accurate way possible. Ideally, down to the second if you can. And only quartz-based movements have been able to do that. Mechanical? They try, but they can't come close. A lot of mechanical movements on average will lose anywhere from roughly 30 seconds a day to several minutes in a month. Quartz movements lose maybe a handful of seconds in a month, if even that. We don't understand how good we had it in the aftermath of the quartz crisis. And watches and watchmaking have just sort of lived in the shadow of that ever since.
one was the Seamaster reference 2531.80.00. It had caliber 1120, which was made exclusively for Omega. In the movie, the watch has a lot more things built into it. We see it in use in several action sequences. It's equipped with a detonator for a hand grenade. Bond sticks with his blue-dialed Seamaster in his third movie, The World Is Not Enough, in 1999. In that movie, the watch is equipped with a piton and a grappling hook that Brosnan's Bond uses to get himself out of a jam. Pierce Brosnan returned for what would turn out to be his final turn as Bond in Die Another Day in 2002. Brosnan stuck with his blue-dialed Seamaster in that movie. This watch once again had a remote detonator built into it, this time activated by twisting the watch's bezel. It also had a laser that you could activate by touching the dial, both of which serve Bond well, as his gadgets always do. By the time the Brosnan movies were done, there was a sense that maybe they'd gone a little too far back into the campiness that had turned off viewers at the end of the Moore run. It was clear to many that it was time for Bond to really go back to his roots. Chapter 7, Daniel Craig's Bond. After another long search, another actor was chosen to play James Bond, an English actor named Daniel Craig, with very few well-known film credits, and he was blonde. So the controversy over casting him in the beginning was really, really intense, as we were.
Yeah, the whole thing about a blonde Bond never really made sense to me because, as even Craig pointed out, Sir Roger Moore, he was blonde. The spread of cell phones didn't do any favors for the watch industry. No, they really didn't. And a lot of people, sadly, that's what they use to tell the time these days. Or, you know, if they want to be kind of bougie and, you know, hip urbanite about it, they'll have a smartwatch, you know, like an Apple Watch or a Samsung watch. But like I keep saying about those, much like with the phones themselves, there is planned obsolescence built in. Not only that, they are watches that you have to charge daily. And eventually, they're going to get bricked. Either through the inability of the rechargeable battery to hold a charge, or through some sort of software, a firmware update, that ultimately ends up bricking the watch itself. Oh no, look at that. You're going to have to go out and spend roughly the same amount of money that you could just spend once on a decent quartz watch somewhere, and just hang on to that for the rest of your life. Smartwatches are a very sneaky way of buying cheap and buying twice, or in this case, buying multiple times. Yeah, it's pretty cool that they've got your smartphone apps being able to display or even be accessed on your watch. But then again, why don't you just pull out your phone and use that? And ultimately, what do you really need a watch for? And the simple answer is to tell the time. Maybe to tell you the date. But primarily, to tell the time. Best thing that can do that is usually sub $200 quartz watch. Maybe something from a decent micro brand like Vtuber, or something a bit more well known like a Casio or a Seiko or a Citizen, or maybe even something from the Swatch Group.
Now in the age of the internet. However, Craig would win over most, if not all, of his early detractors with his take on James Bond. After Pierce Brosnan, the filmmakers returned to Bond's roots in the most literal way possible by adapting, finally, the novel Casino Royale, Fleming's first novel, the first appearance of James Bond. People who had seen a lot of James Bond movies could tell that things were different. It was a little grittier. It was a little more violent. Craig was more of a man of few words and very smoldering intensity that was a bit far from the charm
much like the Bond of the book.
Brosnan. To many longtime fans, Craig's portrayal of Bond was about the most book-accurate one of all the actors that had played him. He was also, as it turns out in real life, into watches and played a rather active role going forward in the type of watches that 007 would wear on screen. The movie even has a scene when Bond and Vesper Lynd are having their first conversation. Eva Green as Vesper notices the watch on Bond's wrist and says something to the effect of, "Nice watch, Rolex?" And he, of course, quickly corrects her with Omega. So we're left with no doubt as to who is the official watchmaker of James Bond in 2006.
Yes.
Craig was seen wearing 2 Omega Seamaster watches in Casino Royale. One
You can use the hands of an analog watch to determine north as well. Yes, you can. Little technique that you learn oftentimes in, like, the Boy Scouts, for example. But yes, it is possible to determine magnetic or true north using the hands of an analog watch. Bit of a trick. Takes some practice, but yeah. Good technique, especially if you're out in the middle of nowhere.
was a version of the blue-dialed Seamaster that Brosnan had worn in all of his films. The other one was from the Omega Planet Ocean collection, more of a...
Yes, this is when we started to see more of the deep-sea saturation divers being worn by Bond. Now, it's really a smart-looking watch. I'm rather fond of it myself. Trouble is, it's a deep-sea diver, and it's another one of those that, yeah, tis a chunky boy.
Dive watch, 600-meter dive watch. The Planet Ocean referenced 2900.50.91. The Planet Ocean was the one used mostly in the outdoor action scenes, whereas the Seamaster was the one in the more elegant scenes. The watches would change, but this formula for the Craig movies was something that was kind of set here and would continue in the movies that followed. Quantum of Solace came out in 2008. It served largely as a sequel to the events in Casino Royale. It's not a favorite of most. I think on repeat viewings it holds up. Daniel Craig does once again wear an Omega Planet Ocean in this movie. The reference 2201.50.00. As much as Quantum of Solace may have disappointed some viewers, Skyfall was Daniel Craig's third movie, and it was the most critically acclaimed Bond movie in a while.
Really, really
Bond
good
is
film.
still wearing Omega watches. He wears an Aquaterra from the Seamaster's more dressy subfamily in
Really decent, go anywhere, do anything sort of watch. Especially one that, if you've got some extra money lying around, and you really want to splurge on a nice little treat for yourself, an Omega Seamaster Aquaterra. Because it really is a very flexible, go anywhere, do anything sort of watch. You can swap out the bracelet for some sportier straps, dress it up, dress it down. Really goes with anything. Hard to go wrong with it. Especially this blue dial, that is sexy. That's a lovely dial.
some of the indoor scenes, whereas he wears another Planet Ocean 600-meter watch in a lot of the outdoor action-oriented scenes.
That was when they started making
was
light
the next
gray
movie in
bezels on
2015.
those.
And it brought back another long missing element from the Bond films. It was missing because of yet another legal dispute, which
Blofeld
was the
and
criminal
Spectre.
organization Spectre and its leader, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, who was, of course, Bond's arch nemesis in the novels as well as in many of the movies. Christoph Waltz, a very acclaimed actor,
He was
came on
good.
board as Blofeld, and Daniel Craig was continuing to wear Omega. This movie was the first appearance on screen for James Bond of a Seamaster 300. If you
Another really good watch. And especially with this particular rotating bezel on it, yeah, you can, at least in theory, track a second time zone if you wanted to. And rather charming lollipop second hand. No date functionality. We're starting to get into the era of high-end watches foregoing any sort of date or day-date functionality and just keeping it very simple.
compare it with the Seamaster Diver, is a much more vintage-looking piece. It's got the broad arrow
Yes,
hands.
more
It's based on a
neo-vintage
watch
looks
that was
coming in
really
now.
intended more as a dress watch than as an actual watch for diving. So Craig liked that vintage look of the Seamaster 300, and adapted that for his role in that movie. In the movie, the Seamaster 300 that Craig wears is on a NATO strap. That was very likely a conscious call out to the Rolex worn by Sean Connery in Goldfinger, which was seen close up on a very similar strap. So the Bond movies are well known for making internal references at times, and I think this was one of those. No Time to Die represented a big sea change in the James Bond series. It also marked the last appearance of Daniel Craig as James Bond. The movie was, of course, plagued, as many other movies were at that time, by delays due to the outbreak of COVID-19. And because of this, the watch that was to make its debut in No Time to Die actually came out a year or more before the movie it was in actually was released.
I remember
so it was
that,
actually
yeah.
possible in 2020 to say that I'm wearing the watch that James Bond wore in No Time to Die, even though No Time to Die had not actually come out, because...
Yeah, they delayed it by a year at least. And even then it was one of those weird things where, yeah, it was in theaters, but I think they also had it premiere online for streaming. So, yeah, I don't know how well it did at the box office. And of course it was a flawed exit for Daniel Craig's Bond. We'll put it that way.
Omega needed to market the watch. Craig was very heavily involved himself in the production of that particular Seamaster Diver 300. There are pictures of Craig visiting Omega's factory in Switzerland, in case anyone is unclear as to how involved he was. As a watch, it was a very cool piece in and of itself. I actually did get to wear that watch and review it a while back. It was made of titanium, which made sense because lightness.
I like the mesh bracelet. That is a really nice touch. And I don't think you've seen that with any watch that Bond has worn. But it's really a nice, elegant touch.
Is always something desirable in a dive watch or a watch.
This is no end of fascinating. Well, thank you, Nico. I've always been a little bit nervous about doing a lot of watch react videos because especially in the beginning when I started doing it, it seemed like the audience was just not really into it as I was. They're just like, oh yeah, that's cool, Rex. We don't really get it ourselves, but yeah, you do you, boo. We'll just be over here watching someone else. So I kind of backed off of it for a while, but it's just, yeah, I'm quite fond and fascinated by watches, by the history, the functionality of them. And unlike a lot of watch snobs out there that really look down the noses at quartz watches, I actually love quartz watches. I like them for their accuracy, but I also like them that they're much more attainable for people of almost any income bracket compared to a lot of mechanical watches that are really priced out of the market for, I mean, I hate to call them the average consumer, but most everyday consumers, they can't really get their hands on those so easily. Most people are not going to be able to afford a fancy Rolex or even an Omega. I mean, you have to remember, these are watches that retail for, on the low end, maybe about $3,000 for the cheap Omega quartz. But most of these other ones that we've seen in the later Bond films with Craig, these are $5,000, sometimes even $10,000 watches. Most people, that's several months' salary for them. That's, a lot of mortgage payments or rent payments or utility payments they could be making. Whereas, a $200, $250 quartz field watch from Vair, from Hamilton, from Casio, companies like that, that's much more attainable. For a lot of people, that's still very expensive, depending on how much they're making at the time, and still not an easy purchase. but it's still one of their nicer purchases they'll be able to make to treat themselves and also have something really useful that can tell the time, look good with whatever clothing they're wearing, and quite possibly last them so long that it becomes a gift that they bequeath to their descendants, to their sons or to their grandsons. I mean, it's much like that with one Seiko watch in particular I got from my grandfather. Um, he was quite fond of them, even though having having been a military man himself and having been quite staunchly opposed uh, to any sort of product by the Japanese, because he grew up in America during wartime, and was a child when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, so harbored that lifelong hatred and hostility towards the Japanese. Also went to work for General Motors for a long time, made a career out of working for them, and also lived through the whole invasion of Japanese cars into the American market, to where he was just staunchly opposed to the notion of any of that quote unquote Jap crap being on American shores. So I find it terribly ironic that he would, for most of his life, prefer to wear Japanese Seiko watches, but he did. And there was one in particular that that he ended up leaving to me. And I've still got it in my watch collection here somewhere. Aduma Maru, hello, hello. Good to see you. It's given me a new perspective on watches. Well, I'm glad. That's one of the things I'm hoping to do with reactions to watch content like this. Sort of introduce people to a bit of a new perspective and realize that they can be more than just pretty shiny things that you slap on your wrist. Or never forgive the Japanese. Well, if the interactions between American and Japanese Twitter users are any indicator, it looks like everyone has sort of moved on and everyone's becoming fast friends once more. And you love to see it. You absolutely love to see it. And it's thanks to the Japanese that we now have phrases entering into the lexicon such as cheese violence. This is giving me new 10K. Yeah, there's several Amigas, certainly a lot of Rolexes out there that are at least $10,000. There are some versions of the Rolex Daytona, which is an incredibly complicated mechanical chronograph movement watch. That's a $50,000 watch, easily. That is reserved for people that, for them, it's like, do you want a fancy sports car for $50,000, or you just want to spend it on a fancy Rolex watch with a stopwatch function? Your choice. And for them, it's nothing. There's even some Cartiers, several Patek Philippe's, A. Lange & Söhne, German brand of watch, 50 grand. I think that's starter territory for some of their fancy watches. Pocket watches tend to be of the same size. A lot of people, I don't think, realize how affordable a lot of pocket watches are now. Yeah, pocket watches have kind of fallen in value. It used to be back in the 80s, and I think in the 90s to a certain extent, the people that we would refer to as the watch snobs of the world, they were really big on collecting pocket watches back then for, antique, historical value, that sort of thing. Nowadays, not so much. That market has shifted collector-wise more towards wristwatches. But yes, there's a lot of sleepers out there and a lot of really just fascinating, beautiful pocket watches available on the market, and in various degrees of operating order. If you can get one serviced and in good working order, God bless you, man. Especially fairly nondescript ones without much decoration, or fancy hunter case ones especially. Yeah. 50K is out cheap over people in that bracket. Yeah, for them, that's nothing. And there's even some fancy bejeweled with lots of colored diamonds and stones, rare types of Rolexes I've seen um, in the boutiques. I've seen them in American boutiques. I've also seen them when I was traveling in Japan. Um, these just super blinged, iced out Rolex Daytonas. Super rare, only like a handful of them ever made. And they cost as much as a house. We're talking 100 grand plus, easily, just because of all the gold and all of the diamonds that have been placed in those watches. It is the height of decadence, really. Somebody who buys a 50k watch, a sports car, is 250k. Yeah, those people who would buy a 50k Rolex Daytona, they will probably drop $250,000 easily for something like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or something like that. Some local made ones from small Ermiger clockwork makers here in Denmark make and sell ones for as low as 199 kroners, or about $20. Yeah, that's really a bargain, isn't it? $20 for a bargain of the century there, and they could easily charge much more, I'm sure. From what I've seen in watchmakers and clockmaker stores here in the countryside, yeah. I know there's still some schools out there that will teach you how to become a watchmaker. Honestly, at one point I considered doing that, being a watchmaker or a serviceman who repairs like grandfather and cuckoo clocks, because I was just fascinated by grandfather and cuckoo clocks when I was a child. Never really acted on that, but there are some trade schools out there, and I think they're part of university training programs. They will train you up to be a watchmaker to the point where you can build your own watches. I mean, I don't really know if that's a high-paying skill for some people, but it's a level of artistry at the very least, and it'd give you a hell of a bragging right whenever people ask you, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a watchmaker. My daily driver is a plebeian Seiko 5 slide rule watch. If I get to minor fuck you money, I'll be upgrading to a Breitling Navitime. A Breitling's a really good one. Breitling's really good. And for the longest time, I think they've also shared movements with the sister brand of Rolex, Tudor. They've got a couple of Panda dial chronographs that they share movements with Breitling chronographs. And they're really, both the Breitlings and the Tudors, lovely, lovely watches. Absolutely. Those used to be all the rage when I was a kid amongst pre-war generation, older people who by the early 2000s and they found themselves coming into a lot of money. Yeah, funny how that works, isn't it?
That you're going to wear into adventures, as James Bond did. It had British military markings on it, which would indicate a watch owned by the British government, which James Bond's watches technically all probably should be. It's still on sale now, along with other versions of the Seamaster. It's called the 007 edition. It doesn't have any really garish movie-type details on it that are obvious, so it's actually...
The last one of those that ever had any sort of garish detail, anything close to that. I think it was either an Omega Seamaster or a Seamaster Planet Ocean. That the second hand, this little counterweight bit over here was replaced with the 007 logo. Not really interested in modern products and not having been able to afford things they wanted when they were young, which they could now. Yeah, delayed gratification. Something which a lot of people in this world could really stand to learn the lesson of. You wanted to be Monroe from Grimm. I don't know who that is. That'd go full weeb and get a Grand Seiko. I actually own a Grand Seiko. When I had a chance to get my first really fancy watch, I went with a Grand Seiko. And a Grand Seiko quartz, too. The 9F quartz movement by Grand Seiko is one of the most accurate quartz movements in the world. and is also just an absolute feat of engineering. I mean, not only does Grand Seiko grow their own quartz crystals in-house, which, yes, you can do that. I did not know that until I found out that Grand Seiko was doing it. Just thought that was so cool. But also, they've got this, I don't know how you would call it, maybe a dampener or some type of braking mechanism on the ticking second hand to keep it from bouncing. And when you look at it in slow motion, it's really almost like a double tick. It uses up more battery life, so you have to replace the batteries more often, but it's still just one of the smoothest ticks you'll ever see. And it's still just one of the crown jewels of my collection. A ton of Bornholmer or long case grandfather clocks were commissioned in that time. As a result, an entire market emerged for them here in Denmark. Yeah, grandfather clocks, I think the popularity of them faded and have faded with the boomers. They were some of the last people to really go in for grandfather clocks. And then after that, it's not really been a thing for the younger generations, Gen X onward. You can still find some beautiful grandfather clocks, both on the antique and secondhand market, but there's still grandfather clock makers, especially in the US, that they make some lovely, lovely clocks. They really do. Is that the quartz mechanical hybrid movement? I think you're thinking of the spring drive movement. Mine is not a spring drive. Mine is just the 9F quartz movement. Spring drive's a little bit different. It's, quartz mechanical hybrid, as you said, with, everything, the kind of quartz crystal bit, keeping it accurate, but also almost acting like a braking mechanism for the second hand, which is just a constant sweep. Just a constant smooth sweep, which I thought, when I first saw spring drives in the metal at a boutique, I'm in love. I still want a snowflake, a Grand Seiko spring drive snowflake. But to me, it's still one of the most beautiful watches in the world. And I still want one so badly. The aftermarket grandfather clocks are making a comeback. There's a male-female disparity in that regard. A lot of people my age want homely houses. Well, that's good. That's good. People are starting to go for grandfather clocks a bit more. Yeah. I mean, you get clever enough, you can find the space for them.
Very cool-looking Seamaster watch with a connection to the most recent James Bond film. And that brings us all the way up to today. At the time of recording this, No Time to Die has been the most recent Bond movie. Daniel Craig has announced that he is leaving the role. The search is actively ongoing and the debate is actively ongoing about who the next James Bond will be and what watch will he be wearing. We'll all find out in due time. One thing's for certain, however, James Bond and his relationship with watches has been a key element of his character from the novels going all the way up to the most recent big screen blockbuster, and we don't expect that to change. Next time you see James Bond, whoever's playing him, don't forget to take a look at his wrist.
I think it was Ian Fleming himself who said that you can tell a lot about a gentleman's choice of timepiece says as much about him as the tailoring of his suit. Yeah, that was a good one. It was a long one. Thank you all for sticking with me on this one.